I mean, there's always a reason why, right? Like the body doesn't make mistakes. And I think especially with anxiety, there's this belief system that like, oh, like you're just born that way. And you mentioned earlier, like grandma had it and great grandma had it, but the body is not making mistakes. It's responding to something in a protective way. So you need to figure out, what's it responding to? What am I protecting myself from? And then heal that.
Welcome to the Calorie Conundrum Podcast with Coach Strick. Join us as we expand the weight loss conversation to beyond just calories and dare to ask the question, why does eating less and exercising more sometimes not produce the desired results? Here's Coach Strick to discuss this Calorie Conundrum.
Welcome to the Calorie Conundrum Podcast. This is Coach Strick, and today we are talking about anxiety. Our guest and anxiety expert today is Jodie Ellenor. Jodie is on a mission to help women heal anxiety holistically so they can spend more time enjoying life and less time fearing it. She helps women eliminate worry, racing thoughts, panic attacks, concentration challenges, and sleepless nights. Not only does she explore the mindset factors that lead to anxiety, but she also uses functional lab testing. She combines her training as a therapist, functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner, and a yoga instructor to truly offer a mind-body approach to healing. Jodie became passionate about functional medicine through her own healing journey and has spent 13 years searching for answers to her own gut and anxiety issues after getting sick while living in Africa. When she isn't talking about anxiety, you will find Jodie outdoors. She has a love affair with nature and is an avid photographer. She also fell in love with surfing during a trip to Costa Rica, though she usually ends up under the waves more often than she rides them. Let's hear what Jodie has to say about anxiety and weight loss. Jodie, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Coach Strick. Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. And today we're discussing a topic that we haven't had on the podcast yet, and that is anxiety. You're an expert in anxiety, and you work as a health coach in this field, helping people that suffer from anxiety. But before we get too far into that, tell us a little bit about your health journey and how you got into this field.
Yeah, it's quite a journey actually, and it goes back to almost 15 years ago when I was living in Africa for about a year and a half. I was living and working there, and I picked up some sort of gut bug. And, before that, I should mention that I was really under the idea that like I could eat anything and I would just be healthy. And I kind of didn't respect the boundaries of my body. So when I got a gut bug in Africa, I figured, I'll just come back to Canada. I'll run a couple tests. I'll take some meds, and then I'll be fine in like a month or two. And that didn't happen actually. So fast forward, years later, and I'm pulling my head out of the sand, deciding to really try and figure out what's been going on with my gut. And then my gut health turned into anxiety issues. And so the medicine community couldn't really give me answers I was looking for. And so that's what got me into more holistic approaches to healing. And as I healed myself, I found that I really loved the knowledge that I was learning. And so I started to incorporate that into my work as well.
Sweet. So I'm assuming 15 years ago, you weren't in the holistic health field at all. And then.
No, I was like your donut, eating, beer, drinking, sugar, loving, sort of sometimes exercised. I did a couple like longer races, but I never considered myself as health conscious. And I used to, laugh at people that went to the health food store. I was like, nah, that's not for me. That's you guys, but that's not me. So definitely was not health conscious back then.
Okay. Yeah. So you're basically an average person.
Yep. Yep.
And so average person, and you developed what would be kind of an average problem nowadays that people are suffering from.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of warped into this thing called anxiety. And so a lot of people have this idea, they've heard of anxiety and they have an idea of what anxiety is in their own mind. But I would like to hear what your definition of anxiety is.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very loaded question. So, what I haven't mentioned yet is that I actually have traditional training as a social worker. So, I have a master's in social work. And so, when we're talking about anxiety from more of a psychological perspective, we see the criteria really created by something called the DSM, or the Diagnostic Statistic Manual. And that's what psychiatry and psychology really uses to diagnose people with anxiety, right? And so if we were to look into the DSM, we would find that anxiety is categorized into different ways. So you have social anxiety, where you might feel anxious being out in a social situation or around other people. And then you might have generalized anxiety, and that's where you worry about everything kind of all the time, and your worries are grander. And then you have, agoraphobia, where you don't leave your house. And then you have specific phobias where you're afraid of like one particular thing. For example, you're afraid of spiders. And so that's a fear that you have. So when we look at it from a DSM perspective, we see these categories of criteria you have to meet. And the idea behind it is these worries morph into behaviors that then are impacting your daily functioning in a way that you can't live life day to day, right? So when I think of anxiety, I think about it a little bit different. I don't necessarily like to categorize people. I think of it more in terms of, you have worries or thoughts that are overwhelming for you, or you may have physiological symptoms like heart palpitations, sweating, that kind, cold and clammy hands, dizziness. So all of those sorts of things can also compromise anxiety. And those feelings or those behaviors are really impacting how you're living your day.
Okay, so basically you're saying that anxiety is kind of a way people are that makes it hard to live a normal life.
Yeah.
Is that kind of basically what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
And so,
Simple version.
yeah. And so, basically, like the Calorie Conundrum podcast, the whole point is to expand the weight loss conversation beyond just calories.
Mm-hmm.
And I know anxiety is definitely something that could affect a person's weight or ability to adhere to a diet, or even function, like you're saying, just in a normal life.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you deal with anxiety, and how does it help with people trying to lose weight?
Yeah, I mean, that's also another very big and important question to ask, right? Because I think we see anxiety come out in a couple of ways. Let's say you're following a specific weight loss regime. I tend to see that people with high levels of anxiety either are afraid to do it, right? So let's talk about that for a minute. So whenever you have anything new, that's going to create a general level of fear for anyone, right? And for people who are really anxious, that fear can actually put them into like a freeze state where you're like, I know I want to do this, but it's like so new that I'm like afraid to do it. And so then you procrastinate and you find these other excuses to do it, because doing something new causes you so much more stress. And that's where we really get into a conversation about the limbic system, right? Because when we're anxious, our limbic system is activated. And for people who are listening or viewing and don't know, the limbic system is part of the brain that's going to filter in information. And so it filters in sensory information, and then it basically, to kind of simplify it, it decides if you need to turn on your fight or flight response or your rest and digest response. And so when the limbic system is active, it's going to want to keep you doing things that are safe all the time. And when we're talking about doing something new, that's quote unquote unsafe. You're kind of stepping outside of like what your norm is or what your tribe is doing. And so if you're already anxious to begin with, those cues to stay safe are going to be there. And so it's going to be a lot harder for you to do something new, even if it's healthy. So there's going to be a lot of resistance there.
Okay. And so you said that that was one area where people, struggle is starting something new. Where are some other areas that around, eating, being healthy in general, but losing weight that people that have anxiety get hung up on?
Yeah, I find sometimes there can almost be a perfectionistic side of things, right? So that's one of the ways that anxiety can present itself is, having to stick by the rules and not leaving the rules. And so it can be very stressful if you have, this diet that you're following that's really, really rigid, and you feel like, oh my gosh, I can't go outside of that. And so then there is actually more anxiety about the diet. And so you lose the beneficial effects because you're so worried about, not going outside of this like rigid rule that you have. So I see that come up quite a bit as well.
Yeah, I think there's probably some people listening that are thinking they have anxiety.
You're probably right.
Yeah,
And
they probably do to some extent.
it's interesting that you say that because I think a lot of us experience it and we don't label it as anxiety. So I work a lot with women. And so I talk to a lot of women who are like, yeah, I've had this my whole life. And only now am I able to label it as anxiety, right? So sometimes we just are a certain way. We don't see it as problematic until it becomes so big that we're like, whoa, or until you hear something like what we're doing right now. And you're like, oh yeah, that's kind of me.
Yeah, and that's the problem with a lot of areas around health, especially. Um, People have symptoms, but because the person next to them has the same symptom and their mom had the same symptom, they think it's just a normal thing to have. And uh, just because it's common doesn't necessarily mean it's normal. And but they have never been told that it's not normal.
Well,
And so,
that's just it,
yeah,
right? And I think, we're starting to see disease being so much more normalized by, conventional medicine and by our peers and by our family and by our culture that we sort of start to think like, oh, okay, like I'm just like everyone else. That's okay that I'm like this. Like,
yeah,
and we can't even see a vision for something different. And when you can't see a vision for something different, then you're never going to get there, right?
yeah, exactly. You don't know what you don't know, and
Mhm.
a lot of people don't know that they're not supposed to be having headaches all the time. They're not supposed to have gut pains, and they're not supposed to be having diarrhea. Like I watched a video of you talking about how you had loose stools forever,
Yeah.
and they don't know that they're not supposed to be having that stuff. They
No,
just try to, you know, get some kind of pill or medication to stop the symptom instead of asking, why is this happening? Um, it's,
exactly.
yeah,
And anxiety is one of those things, right? Like if you go into the conventional medical system, whether it's with your doctor or psychiatry, a lot of times the message that women get and men get as well is, it's just anxiety. It's just a neurochemical imbalance. Like you just need to take this pill. Sometimes therapy is suggested, but very often it's kind of just, let's just make this annoying emotion go away. Let's not ask why it's there. Let's not explore it a little deeper. Let's not figure out if it's a message from your body that something's off. Let's just make it go away.
yeah, it's kind of part of society. The quick fix,
Mm-hmm.
want it right now kind of society is part of the problem with that. And people, they just don't know that they need to ask better questions and slow down sometimes, and so we end up with anxiety instead. Um, so a few things that affect weight loss, that may may or may not be affected by anxiety are stress, as you've kind of mentioned before,
Mm-hmm.
hormones, and blood sugar. Can you expand on some of those?
Yeah. So, I mean, stress is a really big one. And, when we talk about anxiety, we see that it can be caused by stress, right? It's a pretty obvious link there. And when we talk about stress, we can talk about external stressors, like the sea, the big thing that's going on right now, or you're losing your job, or your kids, you have to work and homeschool your kids and all of that kind of thing. So we have those stressors that might create anxiety, not enough time, a lot of worries. So that's going to leave your thoughts kind of thinking all these things. And then we also have these internal stressors, which we haven't really gotten into, but, gut infections or heavy metals, or, we're eating foods that our body doesn't like and we're reacting to them. So all of those things are actually going to activate our stress response, right? So it's going to activate that fight or flight. It's going to send our body into that motion of like, hey, we have to run from a bear. So that's our modern day stress. And so when we stress out the body, what happens is the stress hormone cortisol goes up, right? And so that's where we're allowing our body to have that stress response. And when we have high cortisol, our body actually stores a lot of weight. It stores fat. And, part of that's evolutionary because we want to have that energy to run from the bear. Maybe it's going to chase us for a long time. But if we're in that chronic, stressed out, worried state and we can't get out of it, then we're never going to move into a spot where our cortisol is calm and we can move from that chronic fight or flight, stressed out phase into that rest or digest stage. And that's where a lot of the healing and for your people, a lot of the weight loss is going to happen, right? So if you're in that chronic state of anxiety all the time, you're worrying all the time, or you have stress that's coming at you either internally or externally, you're never really going to be able to move into that healing weight loss phase, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, basically, I've narrowed it down to basically stress is the cause of all our problems as far as health goes.
Yeah.
It's just the type and the amount and how we deal with it. So that kind of leads me to the next question is, so let's say I was a person that's listening to this and says, I think I have anxiety. What are some steps that they can take to, lessen the anxiety or overcome it?
Yeah. There's so many steps to take, and I really am of the perspective that it's a mind and a body approach. And so some of the steps you can take for the mind is to, recognize what is causing stress in your life and try and decrease that. That's a really easy thing to do. But then you also want to practice some calming techniques. And so there's a lot of calming techniques out there. The most well-known calming techniques are going to be meditation, deep breathing, yoga. So all of those things are going to put your body into that rest or digest state and really calm you down. The other big thing, and this probably is something you've talked about a lot, it would be diet, right? So if you're eating foods that are really inflammatory to your body, that's going to lead to that weight gain, but it also can lead to anxiety, right? And so not a lot of people talk about that gut to brain connection, but 90% of our serotonin is made in our gut. So when we're eating these inflammatory foods, one of the symptoms of that is weight gain, but one of them is also anxiety. So by eating clean and eating, something like a paleo diet, you're doing a double whammy where you're allowing your body to lose weight and you're decreasing anxiety at the same time. So that's a really big one. And then the third thing you can do is look at calming minerals. Magnesium is a big one. Potassium is another one. So taking Epsom salt baths would be a really great idea because you're going to start to calm your body down, because when we're stressed out for a long period of time, and again, we're talking about any form of stress, right? So if you've been overweight, for example, for a long period of time, or eating inflammatory foods for a long period of time, that stress is going to burn through your calming minerals. And so it's going to burn through your magnesium and your potassium, which is going to lead you to be anxious. And so that's why we want to replenish them on any sort of healing plan. So those would be some key steps that I think would be pretty easy for people to take to address the anxiety.
Great. Yeah. So I got some follow-up questions for those.
Yeah.
Or statements. So the first thing is that you said was recognize the stressors. And so I just wanted to point that out and highlight that because many times people are banging their head against the wall and then they complain they have a headache. And
I love that analogy.
if they would just, stop banging their head against the wall, then they wouldn't have a headache anymore. And so part of that, as it, pertains to our life, is that just recognizing that, every time I work on this project with this person, I have anxiety or I'm mad or whatever it is. And just things like that, I think, are very important for people to think about, because like you said, just recognizing it and taking it out of your life is a simple fix. First step is you have to recognize that it's there.
Yeah. And I think you raise a very important point, right? Because sometimes we can be blind to the most obvious things. So we think we're living a calm life, but if you take that step back, you're like, whoa, I'm not at all. And I mean, when you take vacation, oftentimes this is when we see this, right? Because we take those 2 weeks, we feel really great. And then we go back to our lives and it's really obvious then what's not working. Or if you spend time away from certain people that are toxic to you, and then all of a sudden you're like, wow, I felt a lot better these couple weeks. So it can be really important, I think, to really take an honest look and be honest with yourself about what's going on, because sometimes it can be really easy to be like, well, that's other people, but it's not me.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another reason why I believe that having coaches is really important, because your family and your friends, they've been around you your whole life. So they're not going to point out these, things that they've been seeing forever. But a coach from the outside looking in can see that you kind of seem a little anxious, maybe we should try some breathing or some yoga or something like that. And so that leads to my next question about the ways to reduce this anxiety. So you mentioned breathing, yoga. What is it about these things that help people, bring their stress levels down?
Yeah, I mean, I could go on and on and on about strategies that really calm the nervous system down, right? So when we are doing breathing, what we're doing is we're actually slowing our breath rate down. And by slowing our breath rate down, we're sending messages to our body that it's safe. And then it allows our body to calm. And I have a really interesting actually example of this. So I actually recently did a stress test. So what that looked like for me is they attached all these gadgets to me. So they looked at, my temperature, they looked at my sweat production, they looked at my heart rate and my breathing. And so when you do these stress tests, they get you to do stressful things. So one of them was, and I can't remember what it's called, but it's where you see like a word and it says blue, but then the color behind it is green. It's written in green. So you have to say the word that it actually is and not the color that it looks, right? So it takes your brain a while. It's a little bit stressful. And then the other thing they had me do was count backwards in like groups of 7, which for me was like very stressful. I don't know how I got through math ever, but it's a long gone skill. So it sent me in a lot of stress. So you could see the stress on it. And they had me just kind of sit for a couple of minutes. And so we measured how my body recovered by just sitting. And then they had me breathe. And so because I'm a trained yoga instructor, I've spent a long time kind of practicing my breath, and my body is very used to specific kinds of breath. And what they saw was that the minute that I went into, it's called the Ujjayi breath that I like to use, but the minute that I went into it, my heart rate actually completely slowed and it started to match my breathing. And we know from research, and if you want to know more about this, you can look at the Heart Math Institute, but we know that when the heart is very rhythmic, the rest of the body kind of follows the heart's rhythm. It sort of sets the pace. So our breathing calms our heart rate down, which then sends these messages of synchronicity out to the rest of the body and then sends the whole body to be calm. So, I mean, that is one of the reasons why breath work can be really powerful. I know that there's, a lot of people, oh yeah, it's just breathing, but it's actually like a really core function that we have conscious control over, right? So you don't need to hire some specialist, although you might want to do some fun courses like Wim Hof and things like that, but you can just start to control your breathing on your own. So one of the strategies that I teach in my 12-week program, the Holistic Anxiety Fix, is a straw breathing strategy. So I have women count their breath for a minute and then breathe through a straw. And so what's happening when they breathe through the straw is that you're forcing the exhale to be slower, right? So you're slowing your breath rate down. So they do that for a minute or two, and then they take the straw away and they count their breath. And their breath rates actually have slowed like a significant amount, usually for most women, after they do the straw breathing. So we're already able to reset the nervous system. And I mean, all you need is a straw. So pretty accessible strategy, right?
Yeah. So the breath is very powerful. And like you said, basically you're talking when you're talking about stress, you're talking about the autonomic nervous system. And so
Yeah.
that's the nervous system that we don't have conscious control over. But the
Yeah.
breath is something that we do have control over. And so by consciously affecting the breath, in turn, we can kind of affect the autonomic nervous system, is basically what you just described. And
Exactly.
so, yeah, it's a very important thing that it's one of the main things I recommend to people, is just make sure you're breathing slowly and paying attention to your breath,
Yeah.
to help relieve that stress and tension in the body. And the last two things you mentioned were the diet and the minerals.
Yeah.
So one thing you mentioned about the diet was, you said stop eating like inflammatory foods or anxiety causing foods.
Yeah.
And so how do I know if the foods are anxiety causing for me? And what are some common anxiety causing foods?
Yeah, I mean, there's food sensitivity tests, but the best way really to tell is to take all the foods out and follow something like a paleo diet, which is naturally lower inflammatory, and see how you feel, rather than spending, hundreds of dollars on these food sensitivity tests. So that's usually where I start with people. The big one actually is gluten. So, I see people who have had anxiety, psychosis, like all sorts of wild mental health symptoms because their body was reacting to gluten, some of whom are actually celiac and didn't know it. And so gluten is like a big one in terms of anxiety. There's a lot of research linking gluten to anxiety. And so if you're kind of like, what is gluten? Where is it in? It's in, breads and pastas, a lot of the good foods, right? The desserts, like muffins, pastries, anything with flour in it has gluten in it. So it hides in a lot of sauces and things like that. And it's very inflammatory for a lot of people. And you actually will see weight loss when you take gluten out for most people, not because we're taking out the carb necessarily, but because we're taking out that inflammatory food. So that's one food. The other one I would say is a close second is sugar. A lot of people that I work with, they take out sugar and they feel a lot better. And that's partially because sugar is feeding gut bugs, and then that's creating a lot of anxiety there. It also sends you on, a blood sugar roller coaster. So you're all over the map. And when your blood sugar is rolling up and down all the time, one of the symptoms of that is anxiety. So, I mean, those are the two foods, if you're going to start with anything, that I would really look at for, reducing anxiety.
Yeah, it's amazing what will happen if you eliminate both of those.
Yeah.
um, And one thing
And
about the
people don't
sugar,
believe it, right? They're like, oh,
yeah,
that's so simple. That's not going to do anything.
yeah,
But you have to, here's the thing, you have to kind of go at it. You can't really cheat. If you want to know, you have to really just do it. You have to commit to it. It's
yeah,
not like I'm eating a low sugar diet or I'm eating a low gluten diet. That's kind of like saying I'm 3/4 of the way pregnant. Like
yeah,
you have to kind of go one way or not, right?
yeah. And it's not easy, like you said. All the good stuff has gluten in it, but
Yeah.
um, I mean, I've done it for a long time now, and
Mm-hmm.
people look at you weird sometimes when you tell them you're gluten free. But I just tell them I've done the research, I know what it says, and that's why I choose to do it. But one thing you said about the sugar that I'd also like to point out is that you said, your blood sugar goes on this roller coaster. Well, one thing that happens all the time is when you feed your children sugar, and
Mm-hmm.
you feed them, they drink a soda, and then 45 minutes later, they're running around like a chicken with their head cut off, and you wonder why they won't sit down, they won't listen, they won't behave or whatever, and their blood sugar's going, haywire.
Yeah.
And so that's another, even, it plays into the how the behavior of the child, but also that plays into the childhood obesity epidemic, and
Mm-hmm.
the health of humanity basically. And so that's something to keep in mind too when it comes to things like sugar.
Yeah. And I mean, kids kind of, they are a great example of like, this is actually what's going on in an adult body, except we might not be running around in the same way, but our
Exactly.
body's feeling the same thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So they just kind of exemplify it in a more obvious way.
Yeah. I love that. That's perfect because no adult's gonna run around and hit their head into the wall and stuff like that. But like you said, they have those same feelings. So what do adults do? They just hold it in, or they take it out another way,
Yeah.
smoking cigarettes, whatever it is. However they deal with those emotions, they have to deal with it some way. And sometimes it's dealing with it by eating more.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of slippery slope. And the kids are just playing it out in their body, like they should naturally. And adults have to kind of repress all that,
Mm-hmm.
outbursts and whatnot. So I'm glad you pointed that out. That's a good point. Then the last thing you mentioned was minerals, and like you said, um, I don't know if it's every single guest I've had on, but almost every guest has mentioned something about diet, um, because we all know, at least in our world, that diet is very important when it comes to health, weight loss, or anything. But I think the last thing you mentioned was about minerals, and I think the diet plays into that too. Obviously, you want to supplement, especially if you're under a lot of stress and you're dealing with things like anxiety or some other kind of special disorder or whatever. But I think by improving your diet, you're improving your minerals. And so you're improving the supply of nutrients you need to deal with the stressors of everyday life. And so
And
that's,
what
yeah,
you're also doing is improving absorption, right? Because if you're eating unhealthy, then you're not going to be able to absorb the minerals that you need, and so then it starts that vicious cycle.
yeah. If it's going, if you're having loose stools, that's a prime example of someone not getting the nutrients they need because your body doesn't have enough time to assimilate and digest, assimilate and utilize those nutrients because they're just going in one end and out the other.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we talked about some of the things that cause anxiety. We talked about some of the ways to deal with this, and improve the situation. What other recommendations would you give somebody that's kind of in this place? Um, they have anxiety. They maybe go to yoga twice a week, or
Hmm.
um, they're trying to improve their diet and they're gluten free most of the time. Things like that. Um, you know, what else would you recommend to somebody in this
So
position?
you mean like people who've sort of done the basics and they're still like, hey, I still don't feel great. What else could be going on here?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really great question. And first of all, I kind of want to give hope. I think sometimes when you go to therapy and you're breathing and you do yoga and you're pretty much everything but a monk and you still don't feel great, it can be like, well, I give up. Like, I'm trying everything. I don't know what to do. And there's definitely ways to dive deeper. And that's where we kind of get into, the functional medicine world, with running lab testing to look at hormones, to look at whether there's gut infections, to see whether mold's living inside of you. Like, all of those things can be deeper causes that food and, Epsom salt baths alone aren't gonna address, right? Like, if you have a giant worm living in you, you can meditate all day long and that worm probably is not going to come out of you. Right. So and that worm's probably causing anxiety. So we really want to dive deeper in that side of things. And then also in the mental health side of things, like really unpacking traumas, looking at intergenerational trauma. That's kind of like the level deeper way to go. So you can do it in both mind and body to really kind of ramp it up a notch in terms of your detective work, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So basically, you're saying there's an answer.
Yeah.
You just got to find the right person to ask the question, I guess. Um,
Exactly. I mean, there's always a reason why, right? Like, the body doesn't make mistakes. And I think especially with anxiety, there's this belief system that like, oh, like you're just born that way. And you mentioned earlier, like grandma had it and great grandma had it, but the body is not making mistakes. It's responding to something in a protective way. So you need to figure out, what's it responding to? What am I protecting myself from? And then heal that.
yeah. So that's somebody that's kind of on the path and maybe not getting as good as results as they wanted. But what
Mhm.
about somebody that is dealing with this anxiety and they just can't do any of this stuff? They find themselves, you tell them, here's the research on gluten, and then, you
Mm.
know, they can't do it. Like, for whatever reason, it's too stressful, or these can't execute. What's some recommendations for that type of person?
Yeah. So, I mean, there can be a couple of reasons why you can't do it, right? One is self-sabotage. And we see that sometimes, I mean, you probably see it a lot too, right? With people who have the best intentions and they know where they want to be. And then when it comes to getting there, they're like, whoa, this energy is unfamiliar. I can't do this. I'm not that person. And so then they sabotage themselves. And so that's a deeper dive, right? Like, that is looking at, what's my self-worth? What are my beliefs about myself and my role here? And kind of really, I would say, finding a therapist and unpacking what the core reason is that you're sabotaging everything that you're doing. Because chances are there's some sort of trauma, whether big or small, that's led to some belief in yourself that you shouldn't be able to succeed, right? So you're just kind of maintaining that belief by wrecking your progress. Then we have kind of the other side of the coin where it's not a self-sabotage issue. It's literally like everything makes me overwhelmed. And I see that. I've been there where I've stood on my oven and I've just been like, I can't even, my brain is such a mess that I can't even figure out, how to follow these instructions because there's too many instructions to make this gluten-free thing. And then I'm like, screw that. And you go for what's easy, right? So that's where you want to really take the path of least resistance. So you don't need to make some extravagant thing. You might even buy something that's gluten-free, at least initially. So the idea is you don't have to go from like, sugar eating gluttonous hooligan to like Mrs. or Mr. pristine, health person. You need to really take it step by step by step. And that first step might be like, buy gluten-free bread from the freezer in the grocery store and don't think about making it, or buy pre-made meals, So making it really easy for yourself to have those small wins, because that's going to build your confidence in yourself and you're going to start to feel better emotionally. And then you can kind of make the momentum go.
Yeah. So basically, you're just saying kind of take baby steps
Yeah.
and work your way up to where you need to be.
A long-winded way of saying that, yes.
All right, Jodie, well, it's been a great interview today. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the audience?
I think that's been it. I mean, it's been lovely joining you today, Coach Strick. I just wanted to let everyone know that if they're looking for me, they can find me. You can email me at jodie@healingjourneyservices.com, or on Instagram. I'm on Instagram a lot, healingjourney_services.
All right, we'll definitely make sure to link that up in the on the website. And thanks for joining me today.
Okay, thanks for having me. You have a good day.
All right, you too. I hope you enjoyed that episode with Jodie. There are many nuggets of wisdom from an expert that has experienced anxiety firsthand and knows what it's like. This episode is another reminder that you are not alone. Whether it is weight loss, anxiety, or any other area related to your health, someone else has experienced something similar. If you can find those people, they will have resources and information that can help you overcome your health problems. Finding these resources can save a lot of time, money, and energy, and that is one of the reasons why I created this podcast, to give people hope and resources to achieve their goals. If you like this episode and would like more information like it, please share this podcast with your family and friends, and visit our website over at calorieconundrum.com. And with that said, this is Coach Strick saying thanks for listening, and remember, when calories in, calories out doesn't work, that, my friend, is a calorie conundrum.
This podcast, including Coach Strick and guests, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects for the use of any information contained herein. Coach Strick and/or guests may recommend products or services in which they have a direct or indirect financial interest. To find out more, please visit www.calorieconundrum.com.